Hello, everybody. We are live, I think. So welcome to FIT Diversity Comic Con for 2021. We are meeting virtually, everybody, this year again. So today's panel that you are watching is called Countering Asian Hate. But it's not such a grave tone. We are going to talk about superheroes and other storytelling modes in order to counter those kind of social challenges. So I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have four speakers today, but one person, Toyoshima, is going to join around 2020 because he's in the class at the moment. So let me go with Enrica first, and please introduce yourself, what kind of titles you've created so far, and a brief introduction. And so first, Enrica Jang, and then Joshua Luna, and then we will go to Wendy Chin-Tanner. So Enrica, go ahead.
I missed a little bit of those instructions, but I think it's to introduce myself. My name is Enrica Jang. I am the editor-in-chief at Red Stylo Media, and we are celebrating our, 12th year now in comics. Very, very excited to be here, and I met a while ago, now almost 8 years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. So I'm very pleased to be here, though. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go to Joshua.
I'm Joshua Luna. Hello. I'm best known as working with my brother called Luna Brothers for Image titles. We were published in 2004 with Ultra, and then we did Girls, and then The Sword, and then I went solo with Whispers. And right now I'm working on online comic strips that I call Americanization that I've been trying to get published. And yeah, that's me.
Okay, thank you. Wendy?
Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy Chin-Tanner. I wear a lot of different hats, but in comics, I am the co-founder and co-publisher of A Wave Blue World, which is a family-owned and run mom-and-pop comic shop that my husband and I founded in 2005, which is the same year that we got married. So the company has grown along with our family. We have 2 little girls, and we have lots of books under our belt after all these years. I also happen to be a poet. I have 2 books of poetry, Turn and Anyone Will Tell You, and I'm also a novelist. I have a forthcoming novel, which is about Asian American experience set in the 1950s called King of the Armadillos, and that's coming out with Flatiron Books in 2023. And before all that, I had an early career as a sociologist, affiliated with Cambridge University, and my area of specialization there was race, ethnicity, discourse analysis, cultural studies, and production of culture. So I'm very pleased to be on this panel.
Thank you so much. So let me introduce myself. So I am Kyunghee Pyun. I'm professor of art history at Fashion Institute of Technology. And every fall semester, I teach Asian American art and design. So this issue of recent Asian hate crimes and other expressions of anxiety have been issues in my own class. And I told my students to come to this panel. So without further ado, we already collected some questions from students and audiences. So I want to go through one by one. And then if we have some time left, we can also talk about your personal stories or any other issues that we left out. So let me start with, like a more general questions. And then we will go into specifics. So one student asked, how do you let out difficult feelings when power is denied to you in your natural state? How do you let out difficult feelings when power is denied to you in your natural state? So if I rephrase this question, it's more like, how do you let out your own difficult feelings or feeling of rejection or disappointment, maybe anxiety, when the context of like a issue of power and authority. So it's a little abstract, but in a way, you deal with these kind of questions in situations for your comic characters, I suppose, right? So who wants to answer this question? So I guess, when authority is denied to you can be interpreted in many ways. I mean, do you have access to equal rights, or do you have access to enough support or rapport with your colleagues? So I think it's relevant for most of us who went through isolation during the pandemic.
I can jump in.
Oh, yes, Wendy, please.
Okay. So, I mean, it's an abstract question, so I will perhaps give a bit of an abstract answer. I mean, I think that storytelling is one of the ways in which human beings have historically understood our own condition as well as the conditions of others. Through storytelling, we can create empathy, right? It's a conduit to empathy, and empathy is the engine of change. So, through whether or not we are marginalized as a creator, it doesn't really matter in terms of the storytelling that we can do. Access is another question, right? But that's beyond the creative scope, I think, of what this question is asking, which is, how do you let out your anxieties? I think it was, how do you let out or grapple with difficult questions within the self? And that's really, the meat of storytelling. That is what makes for compelling storytelling. I mean, there is no character within the comics universe that is interesting and that has stood the test of time without complexity and without an ability for the audience to identify with the difficult emotions that come along with being a human being. So I think that when we want to grapple with difficult issues like racism, sexism, which do not, which intersectionally coexist, right? Racism, sexism, classism, all of the isms are inextricably entwined, right, in an intersectional understanding of oppression. When we want to grapple with that in our stories, and I think we as creators have a responsibility, as living artists, we have a responsibility to speak to what is happening in the world and to speak truth to power. There is a possibility of speaking truth to power within that context. When we do that, we create compelling stories that both feed the people who can identify easily with it, and that also can educate the people who have not been exposed to these stories before.
That is really powerful advice. And Joshua, do you have anything to add on?
The question was, how do you, one more time, how do you remove?
How do you let out difficult feelings when power is denied to you? So we can interpret it in a different way.
I think it helps to look back at my experience going back to 2004, kind of just give context of, how I saw myself as a creator and what I created. And so a lot of, like many Asian Americans, a lot of my work back then was kind of informed by my upbringing and how, a lot of us are taught to assimilate. And, I was kind of a third culture kid growing up on military bases. And so not only was I, acclimating to these foreign environments, like in Italy, Sardinia, and Sicily, and but also assimilating to this Americanness and whiteness or militarism within the U.S. bases I lived on. And at home, my parents were Filipino and they spoke Tagalog and they cooked Filipino food. Is that me? And we also went to Phil-Am functions because there's a lot of Filipinos in the military and Navy. And but there was like this kind of contradiction of, what we do at home is not necessarily what you're encouraged. So they didn't really teach me Tagalog because they didn't want to have me have an accent, or they wanted me to speak English proficiently, and not have too much cultural pride in order to assimilate better. And I understand that mindset because with the tools they had, they were trying to set me up for a better life. But and that with the outside messaging of assimilating into essentially a white dominated society, that was more informed when I went to like art school, which is like predominantly white, and then the comic book industry, which is predominantly white male. And so there was this unspoken expectation to adopt a colorblind ideology, and then on the surface it sounds progressive, but it's actually promoting the idea that color is bad and whiteness is the default. And so I just kind of knew to talk around race, and so I brought up stuff like gender. My first book was about a Latina superhero, and Sword had a female protagonist, and so I talked about things in a nuanced way that didn't touch race, because I knew instinctively that when I brought it up, I kind of would be alienated, ousted, and I think that feeling was validated when I explicitly tried to pitch my comic strips, Americanization to Image, and there was it's uncomfortable to talk about because, we want to assume the industry is progressive and they mean well, and but when you work for someone for like 10 plus years and you expect, most of your books were like kind of greenlit, mostly sight and scene because the rapport was built, it sends a message that there's a type of way to express your otherness, your Asianness, that makes white people comfortable. And like, if you talk about it honestly, if it challenges the status quo in a way that makes them uncomfortable, then it's not allowed. So like, I don't think it's healthy to remove those feelings. I think we need to get it out. We need to address it. And if the industry doesn't support it, then that's it's troubling, because I don't think our only avenue should just be like online, and that's where I'm at right now. And I think that's the only way I can do it to express myself, is because there's not as much gatekeeping or obstacles, and I can just upload it. And it's different from being published, because obviously you have more reach and eyeballs on your work, but and there's prestige attached to it and stuff. And I just think it's important, when we talk about anti-Asian racism, that we aren't just like sprinkling a little bit of diversity and attach, just kind of pulling at the weeds, but really going deep into the roots and see what's causing this and how it's embedded in our society. And it goes back, it's a long history of government policies and media that is not just left in our history, it still kind of adapts into new forms, and it's really baked into our society and everything we do. And I think we need that awareness, and we need platforms that support that awareness. Sorry, that was too long.
Joshua, you gave a long speech.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's okay. I wonder whether Enrica is back in the forum. Enrica, can you speak?
Oh, I'm sorry.
I can. No. Can you hear me?
No problem. Yes. Enrica, yes. Do you want to jump in?
I think my experience, similar to Joshua's, and I was raised in the Midwestern United States, in Ohio. And my father came to the United States from Taiwan to do his master's, met my mother in a university setting. She had been raised in the southern United States, and all of the things that were kind of weird and quirky about my mother, I didn't realize were not, weird where she came from, which is Texas. So they met in a sort of a mixed area in terms of the types of people into this university setting, but then they moved us when I was very young to the suburbs, very white. And it's not something that when you're so little, you realize that you just kind of know you're different, and that it's on you to fit in. But as a kid, you're just trying to fit in. And I don't know that these concepts of it being a cultural issue were so much my concern. So if there was ever anything I experienced in terms of not having like these very difficult feelings of how I was treated differently, or these things, they were all internalized, and I just thought either people didn't like me or I had done something wrong. And it's hard to break out of that, that even as an adult, going through education, going to school in California, traveling the world, living in a much more diverse area. I live in Baltimore, Maryland now, very different even from Ohio to even today. So being able to live in those different places. And then my husband is military, so we lived around the military community. And so, Joshua, a lot of what you experienced, I feel too. But those difficult feelings, I think, again, I internalized them for so long, also structured my life so that I wouldn't feel power denied me. Not that, everybody has that ability. I think I was very fortunate. And I think, like, thinking back on my life, sort of putting myself in a position where I wasn't in that position, or structuring things around me so that doesn't happen so often. I think that was how I handled it before I could even define it. Starting my own company, pursuing my own books, in positions at work, like sort of climbing the ladder so that I'm not, that sounds terrible, not denied power. So, but I think it's defensive. It was defensive, and just internalizing, not being able to quite fit in was how I dealt with it for a very long time. And it's a strange experience as an adult, viewing things a little differently, because the culture is becoming much more aware, giving you this language for it in public that would have been much more of a private party conversation, as opposed to something we talk about very openly now on social media in a public sphere. So.
Yeah, so we have other questions. So I am jumping in to just shift a little bit of our tone. But what you are saying, all of you, is you have your internalized experiences, but in a way, through storytelling or setting up a company or finding collaborators or allies, you somehow found your own platform. And I think that is really brave action. And actually, it's very common for ethnic citizens to become entrepreneurs. As Enrica just mentioned, instead of being in the corporate ladder in order to fitting in, it is hard, so that they come up with their own small business or mid-sized businesses, and becoming their own boss in a way. So being entrepreneurial is another way of, I guess, letting out, those uncomfortable and very ambivalent situations to the wider public. We also see a lot of these examples among fashion designers and fine artists as well, not just the comic artists. So thank you for sharing your personal experiences with the audience. It will empower young students, I think. Anyhow, so let's go to the second question. So the second question is, storytelling is a very important platform for all of you to make engagement with other communities, or beyond your own family unit. So is there anything we can do as storytellers to either bring racism against Asians to light or even lessen its occurrence? Can you mention some of those case studies or examples that transformed these difficult feelings in order to overcome challenges? It could be your own story, but it could be any other titles that you've just read or examples that might be interesting for our audience.
I don't want to talk too long. Should I go? I mean,
yeah, Joshua, you can go ahead. Yes.
I just want to kind of like talk about, we talk about lessening anti-Asian racism, just even in the framing of that concept, it's important. It almost suggests that we have to be okay with just a normal level of racism. And like, I feel like, when you have like a cancer, you don't want less cancer, you want it gone. So I think our goal is to we should probably shoot for the moon in terms of really digging deep and not just going for obvious forms of it, but also, the explicit things that happen in the news, but the more insidious ways of are you able to, are storytellers able to get their stories out? Will it be platformed? That's a form of racism. So even if we have the ability to effectively stop racism, can we tell our story? Like, does society or institutions foster environments where we can tell them? Are they throttled online, even if you upload them? So there's all sorts of things to consider where the onus really isn't on Asians. It shouldn't be, because that's really putting the blame on victims, basically. And there needs to be more responsibility of people in power, because they have power. And I don't take up too much time, but I'll let others talk.
I think that's an incredibly important point. And, I would definitely want to jump in there and expand on it. I agree with you entirely. I think it's important, as you say, to problematize the question and this kind of paradigm behind the question, which places the onus on Asian Americans to not only deal with the reality, with the lived experience of racism, but to also fix it. And that's a very problematic position to be in, and an inappropriate position to be in. As storytellers, I think something that we need to bear in mind at this point, which I feel like is a bit of an inflection point with the, with our social activism and with so much greater awareness, I think, in the kind of linguistic and narrative understanding culturally that we now have around racism and around different forms of oppression. I mean, I am perhaps showing my age here, but I started college in the 1990s, and I was in graduate school in the 2000s, and we did not have the kind of vocabulary around racism, sexism, all of the other isms that my 14-year-old daughter does, for example. I mean, she blows me away with the way in which she can articulate and unpack different things that happen culturally, or even things that happen to her at school. She's a mixed race, some might say white passing Asian American teenager, and she has dealt with racism. And she has a vocabulary for being able to call it out and speak about it, which, I'm very, very grateful for. Of course, that is in part, my parenting, but it's also just kind of out there. So I think that we're at a point where we have an opportunity as storytellers to move beyond catering to the white gaze and catering to white gatekeeping in the way that we have been sort of sequestered before. You know, if you look at narratives, not even in the comics community, but Asian American narratives in media and culture on the whole, I would say that before this decade, we've had a lot of the same narratives over and over again. We've had a lot of the same narratives about, you know, a first generation immigrant who faces obstacles and then makes good, right? And that is a narrative that hinges on what Joshua and Enrica were talking about assimilation. That is based on an assimilation is good model minority narrative, right? For better or worse, and really for worse, because the model minority narrative was, you know, the phrase was coined by William Peterson, who was, you know, for all intents and purposes, a white supremacist thinker at Berkeley in the 1960s, as a way to create a wedge between the Black community and the Asian American community that was, you know, becoming very active in solidarity around the civil rights movement. So he used this term to create a differentiation, praising Japanese Americans specifically for being hardworking and, you know, servile and not creating problems, juxtaposed with Black Americans who were troublemakers, right? And so, you know, unfortunately, this period of time coincided with a huge influx of Asian immigration after 1965. So we have a huge wave of new immigrants who do not know about the racial triangulation history of this country, who do not know also about the massive contributions that Asian Americans have made historically to this country since we arrived during the gold rush and even before, you know. And so you have an issue here where you have all of these new Asian immigrants who are buying into what is effectively a very problematic and toxic concept around, you know, the model minority concept, and it's crumbs from the master's table, right? It's accepting scraps from the table. And I think that we're at a point where, you know, we need to internalize our entitlement to a seat at that table. You know, we don't have to beg for it. We don't have to ask for it. We don't have to, you know, trot out our own stories of trauma in order to humanize ourselves, in order to get that seat at the table. We are entitled to it. And I think we are at a moment in time in which we can expand our narratives, you know, beyond that model minority narrative, beyond memoir. I mean, believe me, I love memoir, but we are not only about memoir. What about historical fiction? What about Asian American romance stories? What about speculative fiction? You know, like we have such a wide breadth of stories that are yet untold. And I would like to see them. I want to read them.
Thank you, Wendy. Like a diversification of genre is an interesting idea. And I also like the fact that younger generations have a more articulate vocabulary to describe these problems. That's very important. I mean, as you said, there are experiences, but there were no terms for those maybe 30 years ago. So, Enrica, do you want to add something?
I don't know that there is much to add, actually. I agree that language being there for a younger generation, even for myself, to have that language available now in a non-academic setting. I went to Berkeley, and this was conversations that were happening in an academic setting, and it's something that almost like it was sort of this brain space as opposed to our lived experience, but now it's very much part of our discussion in a public space now. So that is a change that I've seen in my lifetime. And so I think it's pretty exciting for a younger generation to have all of that. I think the one thing that I see people stumbling over often, the intention being the thing that if I didn't intend to hurt anybody, that the pain is not there, or that should lessen it somehow. And when you have wronged someone, there is that desire to like let people know I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to hurt you. And now I don't know how to grapple with the hurt. And I think that that is the next kind of step that I think storytellers could share or should share, that when it's not intentional, where that pain comes from, and then a space for reconciliation, forgiveness, or reapproaching. How can I can call out someone who's hurt me, or I can identify the hurt that I've caused. I'm trying to make it better. If I didn't intend to do it, how can we reapproach each other and not be so harsh with one another, or give someone some space to ask for forgiveness? Like, what would that actually entail, as opposed to abject, just because you didn't mean it doesn't mean it didn't happen kind of anger. I think a lot of people are looking for that space. And so as storytellers, if we share how something somebody didn't intend still hurt, not because they're bad people, but we now have a language to share why it hurt, then we have an opportunity to heal. And I think storytelling and even our discourse should include a space for forgiveness.
That is very important remark. The space of forgiveness. In the recent years, especially during my long years of teaching, I see somehow more and more gender non-conforming students. And I also look back 20 years ago when I started teaching, we were not really keen on asking preferential pronouns or any other identity politics. So I sometimes wonder, they should forgive me for sometimes being insensitive. Just Enrica said, I didn't really intend to hurt or offend anybody, but simply ignorant, and also I didn't have that articulate vocabulary. So in the most recent years, I am actually contemplating on my past as a teacher, like a novice teachers. I could have hurt other people's feelings and so forth. But moving on, students were talking about some public art displays. You probably noticed the subway, display boards with the Stop Asian Hate, or other public messages on it. And students were wondering, are these posters on public transportation effective in changing people's negative behavior and actions, or are they just there for the shows or like political reasons? So it's more like a reception of those public art campaigns in recent years. And because you are also visual artist, we want to know like what your comments on those.
I feel strongly that on the one hand, I do think they're performative. I do. But I don't think they're just for show. I think the performance is in fact necessary. And it's again sort of pushing into the public sphere something that people might not have realized is actually pretty hateful. And if the question is that, like, wait a minute, I don't hate Asians, and yet these things are happening, that you're asking someone a question, asking them to encounter something that they either don't realize or didn't realize is so hateful. And so I believe they are performative, but I feel that the performance is necessary.
Okay, so anybody else? You haven't been to New York City public transportation for so many years, Joshua?
Yeah, so not to make it specific, but going back to my experience with image, I bring it up because we talk about racism as an abstract, and like to have such a personal experience, it was traumatic actually. And so I pitched the book, the initial reaction was first silence, which is strange because they always look forward to when you pitches after that rapport we built over 10 years. And eventually the reaction was, he didn't like how I talked about race. He said it was angry. He said that I'm not talking about Asians in the right way, and there wasn't an audience for it. And so that's just to contextualize, later on, they slap on a hashtag Stop Asian Hate on their website. And it's like, it really just shows that contradictory nature of the performativeness of what they're, are they actually pushing for change, or do they just want the appearance of it? And do they actually want things that challenge racism, or delve deep into why it's happening and what actual Asians are feeling, honestly? And, or do they just want Asians who crush that narrative and hide the narrative and are more palatable for the white gaze and make them feel comfortable? And so just that just gives an example of a personal experience where that hashtag is performative, and it is used, just to give thoughts and prayers kind of thing, where there's not much, investment into changing things. And yeah.
So that's something that
sorry.
I
But I just want to say too, sorry, that as much as I know I'm talking about a lot of negativity, but I got a lot of support online, and just, I want to make sure that people know that I'm really grateful for, my work resonates with a lot of people. And so I don't regret speaking up, because it has allowed catharsis for not only me, but a lot of people who the work speaks to. So it's not just about, who deplatformed me or whatever. It's like, there's also a support network there when you speak out. So that's not to discourage speaking out. Sorry. I just want to say that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just I never thought about that aspect of performative aspects of those display boards. Wendy, do you have any comment as a sociologist?
Sure, yeah. I think the question is very interesting about the posters, because yes, as everyone here was saying, while it is at its inception point a performative act, if it raises awareness and creates a kind of spark for further investigation and further understanding, then it's worthwhile for them to be there, the posters, right? I mean, but in and of themselves, as a singular gesture, it's an empty gesture. It needs to be followed up by education, policy, actual change, right? And the posters are speaking to the concept of overt racism, right? Racism that is physically violent. And that has become, unfortunately, this kind of benchmark in our culture by which we understand what is racism. Racism is this incredibly severe thing, and there is this physically harmful thing. Whereas, I think that creates a problematic kind of false dichotomy, because really racism is a spectrum of different things that can happen to you, microaggressions, being overlooked rather for jobs, things like that. There can be this massive range, and I think that when we focus only on the idea of overt, extreme, radical racism and discount all the rest, then we create this kind of myopia, which is unhelpful and problematic. So that's what I think about the posters.
Thank you so much. So, in relation to poster, I want to talk a little bit about dissemination of comics. Like I see a lot of these poetry in motion posters on subways in New York City. So that is diverse poets. Their poem is reproduced on the subway walls. And I don't know other people how attentively they are reading, but that's my continuing education. I read these poems after so many years from secondary education. I read it, and then I also search for these poets, and they are coming from really diverse backgrounds. Some are, award-winning poets, and some are less known, and so forth. But in terms of comics, what would be an ideal platform of dissemination? If you want to see more, I mean, usually comics are now in the forms of websites or the comic books, or maybe it can be made into feature films. But can you envision a little bit more invigorating dissemination platforms? Like a more ideal terms, what more do you want to see? Do you want to see more exhibitions on comics, or do you want to see more like a Comic-Con type of get-together events, or do you want to have a more public funding toward, let's say, public art forms for comics? What do you envision in order to empower the message that you are creating? Maybe it's a little too far-fetched questions.
You mean like modes of distribution,
yeah, distributions. Like you have some specialized publishers for comics, right? But do you want more of those publishers versus content creators, or how can I say, communities of comic enthusiasts? What else do you want to have more?
Well, for me personally, I remember I got into comics really early because they used to be in grocery stores just next to the aisle, the cashier, and it was so accessible. Like, when my mom was shopping, I would just go there and get exposed to all this stuff. And that's not the case anymore. I think they did away with those racks, spinner racks. But it's such a great way for a normal person who's not really going to a comic store. Now you could go. Well, now COVID, I don't know. But it was such a great way to be reached. And I wish there were more kind of like avenues for that. And also, I don't know. Also, in college, I majored in sequential art, and they taught comic books in those my classes, and it was I think these comics should be taught more in classrooms, to be honest. I think it's such an immediate way of, for me, I'm so visual. It gets to me quicker, and it gets to the heart quicker and the mind all together at once, because we have a tendency to intellectualize these like really heavy topics. And yeah, I'm not sure if that was the answer, but
no, it was a very good answer. Wendy,
okay.
Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I feel, perhaps because I'm a parent, but also, I have a background as an educator. I think that that increasing the visibility of comics in the educational market and in the educational spaces, not just higher education, would be really, really, really useful. Like right now, all we have, I think, in schools to represent Asian Americans is American-born Chinese, pretty much. I mean, I think that is really the only book that is widely taught in schools, in a school context. And we have so many more stories than that. And perhaps as creators, as a community of creators, we should be thinking more along the lines of like collaboration. Perhaps maybe we need to create more anthologies with educational content. I don't know, just kind of like thinking off the top of my head, right? Like things that are geared towards this sort of greater visibility. And that's also a great point about grocery stores. I wasn't introduced to comics in a grocery store, but I was introduced to comics in like my little local news shop. I grew up in Brooklyn, and my dad would take me to, the corner store that was owned by South Asians, and there was a spinner rack, and there were lots of comics there, and my dad would let me pick out one. whenever we went to buy the newspaper, and also a Hershey's bar. So there was this sort of very kind of, very nostalgic kind of combination of being allowed to have a whole candy bar and being allowed to pick out a comic. So, I would like to see children have those sorts of experiences and opportunities again, to be exposed to comics outside of the context of a specialized comic book shop. Not that they're not great, they certainly are, but it's important to have them be available, across many different spaces, because we have to remember that not everyone is privileged enough to have a comic book shop near them or to be brought into one, right? And they're not always welcoming spaces. Let's be honest, they're not always welcoming spaces for non-white males, essentially, right? Or non-cis white males, right? Like, I mean, I have friends who are gay white men who talk about, being teenagers and, feeling very unwelcome and very unsafe in comic spaces, right?
That's really interesting point. So, Enrica?
I agree with all of that. I think education, especially having the experience, the things that I connected with as a young person, I've pursued my entire life. So introducing more of these stories for younger students, I mean, you're going to see that dividend. I think what I'm hopeful about and what I'm encouraged by is I think it's easier now than it has ever been to get your work into the public sphere. So I think the tools for dissemination are with us. Social media, for all of its problems, this is a tool that can be used for good. And I do think that we have the tools now, just like we have a language now that was not available before. And so what I would say to young creators is get it out there. Get your stuff out there. Finish your projects. Get the work out there, because as this content moves out and people their bandwidth starts to widen and they're starting to look for these things, you want to be there when they go looking. And as these conversations continue and people are encouraged to widen their horizons, you want to be there when they start looking. So get all that stuff out there. Tell your story and use the tools that are available to you for free. As you said, if you're privileged enough to have access to social media, of course, that is a factor. But as we push for more equality and internet access and these kinds of things, we have the tools to get our work out there.
Thank you so much. I mean, I remember in several exhibition experiences, we had exhibitions on some famous cartoonists. The mouse, the cartoon had a huge exhibition in the city of New York Museum, and Jewish Museum had another big exhibition on one of those early cartoonists and so forth. So those are mainstream outlets where adults can experience comics, not in the subculture context, but more like a public art section. And it's very important to have a recommended list of comics, right, that are useful for certain age groups and like students in general. So perhaps we should create advocacy for those for national education forums. Certainly, there is a room for additional readings. This is really helpful. I want to develop this issue further. But anyhow, going back to sort of our concluding remark, some of you mentioned that microaggression versus this overt violent racism, and one student is asking that if they witness a microaggression against Asian people, like a private conversation or texting, what is the best way to counteract without making the aggressor more aggressive? So I guess it's a practical tool as a writer for our younger students. What are you going to do if you come across those situations in private conversation, and what would be a nice way of saying that it is wrong and
I mean, I think that the question is a little bit deceptively simple because there's a lot of nuance to it in terms of um, power and positionality, right? I think first and
Yes.
foremost, the person who is noticing the microaggression needs to assess whether or not they are safe in terms of whether or not they are in a safe position to call out or speak out against the microaggression. And speaking perhaps a little bit as a parent too, I would say that it's very important for the victim to not also have the responsibility of fighting for themselves, that it is really the responsibility of the people around them to speak up, right? So, I talk to my children about the importance of speaking up for their friends, right? Not only for themselves. And in fact, that is a way to protect one another. I'm not really on social media too much, so I'm not sure about. I'm sure Joshua and Enrica have a better understanding of how to deal with microaggressions online. But
Yeah. Well, yeah, I actually have a whole Know Your Meme page dedicated to me with like Nazis from 4chan just denigrating my looks and making fun of me, the big and just overt bigotry and slurs, everything you could imagine, and warping my art, mocking my messaging, anti-bigotry messaging. And so that came from just talking about, my experiences and, my Asian American Filipino experience, honestly. And I think those people, they're going to hate you no matter what. And it's best, I try my best to ignore it. But of course, every now and then it pops up and it hurts. It's really disturbing to see people hate you that much for speaking your truth. But there are also people that, it resonates with and they feel seen, and it helps to get that community, because I live in the South, and it's in a town with very strong Confederate history and Confederate flags everywhere. And, and if I see a microaggression in person, it's probably not going to be someone stepping in to help you, because it's pretty, Trump was bad enough that era, then add COVID racism to that. They just added like gasoline to the fire because they just want more scapegoating, And so, it really depends on your level of safety, and if it's, and even if it's like, physical threat, there could be a threat of being fired, or they have some sort of institutional power over you. So there's a lot of danger in speaking out, when you're marginalized, because there's a lot of levers of power that people in power can use against you. So I'd say for everyone, it depends. Like, tread carefully, because every situation is different. Every person is a different situation. So yeah.
And Enrica?
This is it's a very difficult thing, because especially explaining to someone that just because it's funny doesn't mean it's not really crappy, like, or just a really terrible thing to do. And it seems to me that people can and should understand the language of, it's mean. This is mean. It's not nice. And again, you might not have intended to hurt. You might not have known you were hurting someone, but it's not really nice. And I like to think that appealing to their better nature helps. But that question of worrying about making the aggressor more aggressive, that aggression is there. It's just there. And if it comes out, that's pretty telling. Now, people, they're just difficult conversations to have, but continuing to encourage folks to have them and call it out, that's important. And it's not going to work immediately, but if you're called out and other people don't let the one who's the target of it kind of suffer alone, those numbers have to come up. They have to come up. And so continuing to encourage people to have those tough conversations, continuing to encourage people, just because it's funny doesn't mean it's just not really mean. And if you don't care, you can't make someone care, but you don't get that moment back if you don't let them know. So I would continue to encourage you to do it. I hate, Joshua, that happened to you. And
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I would add though that, there's something called bystander effect, right? Where aggressors feel entitled to, that they feel that they can get away with these kinds of actions because there is an effect where people who are witnessing it freeze, right? So I think to answer this student's question, I assume just from the context of the question that the student is not in fact Asian themselves. So I'm assuming, just kind of like reading in the context, that they are an ally, which is great. So, if they're in a position of being an ally, they also have to think about their safety. And I think that there are a lot of great organizations that teach bystander training and bystander intervention training. One of the organizations that was doing a lot of free online Zooms during the height of anti-Asian hate crimes in the spring was Holla Back. I think it's the Holla Back organization. I'm not sure if they're still doing free online Zooms, but a quick Google will help you find all kinds of bystander intervention training programs. And I think that that's a really good thing to learn, just to kind of like internalize when you're in that situation. If you're on public transportation, if you're on the street, what can you do? What, you just have to practice this kind of list of kind of possible interventions to help or to get yourself away safely and whatnot.
Oh, so thank you so much. It's already 12:57. Unfortunately, Ted Toyoshima cannot join us today because of his weak Wi-Fi signal. And we'd like to thank everybody for coming today. But to reiterate our conversation today, it is 2021, and it's very different from 30 years ago or 20 years ago. A lot of organizations that students belong to, they have those training programs and ally programs, so that you may seek for more help when you go through the microaggression or any other issues of social injustice. So thank you again for coming. And then there is an additional announcement by Ramon. So thank you, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. My name is Ramon Gill. I'm the organizer of Diversity Comic Con. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming to the panelists today, and for everyone who watched. And what's good about doing it this way is that people can watch our panel forever, like tomorrow or next year or whatever. And in last year, even though we had a number of people watching it live, a lot more people joined afterwards. And so and feel free to share the link with your friends. We'll make sure it's available on the website as well as on Facebook and on YouTube. One last announcement, but thank you very much. One last thing I want to announce: we have the virtual artist alley going on right now, and I'm going to post that in the chat. So if anybody wants to join us to meet other creators, and at I think it's at 4 p.m. we're having another panel on isms, using isms in your stories. So if you guys want to join us for that, we're having that at 4 o'clock. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kyunghee. Kyunghee, thank you for moderating. You did a great job, and everybody else was amazing. And we hope to see you next year at Diversity Comic Con, which will be live and online next year. So
we'll be there. Have a good one. Thank you, guys.
It
thanks.
was a pleasure to see you all.
Take care.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so
Nice
much.
meeting and talking to you. Thank you so much. Okay.
Anyhow, Ramon, thank you
Bye-bye.
so much for organizing. Bye.